Today I'm going to talk about complexity science as a new basis for managing forests. It's a bit of an academic undertaking to tackle first thing in the morning. So I'm going to spend, I don't know, maybe a third of the talk trying to explain a little bit of what complexity science is for everybody. And then I've got a couple of examples of how you can use this kind of thinking in research and in understanding forests. And depending on how time goes, I'll go through those examples or I'll just drop one. And then I'll wrap up maybe with just a little bit on retention. So I'm from Smithers in north central BC, right where the little arrow points to. And my work experience, this is I'm sure you've seen these maps. We love our biogeoclimatic maps in BC. But I throw it up to show you where I live and to convey to you that I've worked in the subboreal spruce zone a lot, which is that purpley stuff, and as well as up north and as well as west towards the coast. I've been up and down in elevation. So I've worked in a lot of different forest types, and that's kind of colored my experience. So the next thing I want to do is just give you a bit of an insight into my experiences, which kind of shapes how I got to the bottom, which is forests as complex systems. So first off, when I first started working, I worked for a couple of years in that ecologic classification system. And that really affected how I thought about forests and kind of this hierarchical view of different ecosystems and blah, blah. During that time of working on the classification and just being kind of a general silviculturist, I spent 10 years in clear cuts. And that was basically 10 years trying to get little planted trees to survive and grow, and whether or not vegetation mattered. And, it was full on trying to reforest clear cuts. And at that time there was nothing left, right? There was 3 meter knockdown or whatever it was called, and everything was just flattened, right? And so after 10 years of that, I started getting into retention issues, which is nominally what this meeting is about, I think. And I started to work with wildlife people and to spend a lot more time thinking about forest structure and forest dynamics and how forest ecosystems function. And I got myself out of clear cuts, which I kind of enjoyed, and started working on partial cutting issues and leaving variable amounts of trees, either scattered or patches or whatever. Which kind of naturally led into working on stand dynamics. And then it all kind of got blown up. This was a very logical career to that point, by the mountain pine beetle. And I spent 10 years on the mountain pine beetle. And it has definitely affected my thinking on forests. It was depressing at the start, but then you kind of realize that it's just a disturbance. And there's lots of opportunities to work with this disturbance in order to have really good forest management. I don't think we necessarily did a very good job in British Columbia of managing the mountain pine beetle. We kind of freaked out and cranked up our annual allowable cuts and harvested at high rates. And I'm not sure in retrospect that was a good idea. We could have been much more strategic and better at managing the mountain pine beetle epidemic. But that's the way it goes. It was a difficult situation, but definitely affects how you think about forests and how you think about disturbance and how to deal with unexpected events. How do you deal when crap happens and you just weren't expecting it? And how do you have an intellectual framework as a management organization to deal with those sorts of things? Which brings me to forests as complex adaptive systems. I think I've been working on this now for, close to 10 years. Thinking about forests as complex systems. And I still am not sure that it's a good idea. I think it is. I think it's helped me, but I struggle with, how do you implement it operationally? How do you make it work? And if there's one take-home message I'd like you to get from the whole talk, which is a bit of an academic talk, it's that this is all about a cultural shift in how you think about how forests function and how you think about ways to manage them. How do you intellectually approach managing forests, and can we do it better than we've been doing it in the past? Is there better intellectual frameworks? It's not like there's some radical change here. It's subtle shifts in how you think about issues and how you manage risk. And I really think that as our climate changes, as our economies change, various things happen, a lot of forest management is managing risk. And I think the intellectual framework of thinking of forests as complex systems helps with that. So I've mentioned some of this already, that we're kind of in new realities. There's climate's changing, there's changing biotic, abiotic conditions, unexpected disturbances, like big ones like the mountain pine beetle, but there's all sorts of little stuff going on too. And in many cases, it's all about little stuff, kind of cumulative, low-level, slow stressing things that are going on that are hard to track and hard to keep track of, that are really important for us to understand how they're impacting forests and our management practices. The multiple threats to productivity, I mean, that's, like I say, the mountain, it's my background, and what I've been working on in the last few years is kind of giving me this bias towards disturbances, various things are happening, and kind of threatening traditional productivity as we understand it. Economic social change, so on. I believe this, that the notions of homogeneity and stability as a basis for management present a bunch of risks. I mean, our management regime in forestry in the last 100 years has been, we will do something, and then we will get a known amount of cubic meters per hectare at a known time frame ahead, and we believe that. And I don't think that works anymore. It's not going to pan out that way, and we can't have this expectation. A lot of our models are based on that sort of thinking, and I simply don't think it's going to work. I'm sure some of you out there would disagree with that opinion, but that's my take on it. And then at the very bottom, I kind of touched on that already, but change will be neither completely random nor entirely deterministic. And that's what we have to be able to sort out. We can manage, we can influence how things go, but it's how we intellectually sort that through. Okay, so why should you care about complexity science? Again, I've kind of said this. Management based on expectation of order, predictability, and replication of earlier success is fraught with risk. So we can't necessarily keep doing what we've been doing and expecting it to keep working. I like this quote from Peter, right, who's a professor I believe in Minnesota. Given that forests cover a third of the terrestrial globe and play a crucial role in the Earth's system, terrestrial biomes, and human economy, it's imperative we constantly improve our approach to the science and practice of forest management. And that's what I'm trying to talk about this morning, so early in the morning. So where does complexity science kind of fit in how we've thought about things? Well, we've had biodiversity. I don't know how long has that been kicking around? 25 years. And sustainability as a notion to manage. So biodiversity, we want to maintain it. We want to have sustainability, and in traditional timber sense, that would be sustainability of a harvest. We've broadened that out to sustainability of various environmental values. And then we started talking about ecological integrity, I don't know, 15 years ago. Resilience has become kind of a buzzword and gets used a lot. And then I think complexity just kind of comes after it. It comes next. It's a logical progression in our thinking about how to manage forests. So what is a complex system? The most simple definition, it's any system with many interacting components. So for example, people that design freeway systems and try to make sure that the cars all keep going and don't grind to a halt, that's a complex system. It's got many components to it, and you kind of have to start at the bottom and figure out why is it these cars aren't moving anymore? Is it because we don't have enough, it's not wide enough? There's too many people living in one spot and they all go on the road at the same time, right? Economies are complex systems. And forests are actually really nice examples of complex systems. So what is complexity? These are terms that we use in forestry all the time: diverse, heterogeneous, variable. Well, those things describe the range of elements or components in a system. For example, they describe the number of tree species you have, or the size of the trees, or maybe the temperature regime, or the amount of precipitation that the site receives. Or the type of pathogens that might be there. Whereas complexity and complex describe the nature and outcomes of the interactions among those elements. So it's all about the interactions. How does tree species, maybe tree size, the climate, and maybe some disturbance agents all interact to result in what you end up getting? And so you're thinking about the interactions rather than teasing apart one thing and holding everything else constant. That's our traditional experimental approach in forestry. We hold something constant. Sorry, we manipulate something we're interested in manipulating, and we hold everything else constant. Whereas with complexity, you're always looking at the interactions bottom up, how the system, and because of these interactions, surprising or emergent phenomena can arise due to the interactions among many components of the system. And this happens to us all the time in forestry. Things happen that we weren't expecting. And again, the traditional approach is often to say, well, that was just a weird event, so we'll just ignore it, and we'll carry on the way we've been before. Or something happens to like the mountain pine beetle. Even that, to a certain extent, was thrown off as a weird event, and well, we'll just carry on, right? So I don't think that's a good idea anymore. We can't just keep saying things are weird events and then go back and carry on as we carried on before. So I had to do this. I'm sorry. I put Edmonton down at the bottom. So there's kind of order, which is highly structured, highly things are very organized, and your streets in Edmonton are very organized. Everything kind of goes. There's they're wide. And they're very, and then the numbering system is just it's a very orderly system, right? And so I don't know if because of the way your streets are laid out in Edmonton affects your forest management or not, but it can be quite orderly as well, right? I mean, I know you tend to say there's, we manage deciduous and we manage conifers, and they're kind of separate. And then there's been arguments for years about mixing them together. I'm not sure how those have been resolved. So maybe there is something to me doing this to Edmonton. And then, so then some other place that things are a bit more chaotic. Beijing. Things are a bit more chaotic, but there's reasons. I mean, they've been at it for a long time, and it may look totally out of control to us, but it's actually really organized, and there's a lot of interactions going on, and it makes sense. And so it maybe under that condition you get a bit different forestry. And then there's disorder over on. We don't really want that, right? We don't want to be just totally unorganized. We don't want disorder. You've got to have the right tree species mixed with the right tree species and the right kind of compositions and the right structural and everything else, right? So you don't want disorder. It's not just random. One more of these. Just this, I don't know if this will help you or not, but try to think about complexity. Think about a symphony, written by Bach or whoever, Mozart, right? There's a whole bunch of instruments. And it's how these instruments and how the musicians interact that produces this magnificent symphony, right? And so that in a sense is complexity, right? It's how the various components interact to produce something unbelievably good, marvelous, that you'd never thought was possible. So I don't know if that helps or not. You can think about it the same way in terms of poetry and prose, and you can think about it the same way in art. Over there at the far side, Congo the chimp. I mean, that's not, that's probably not the way we want to manage forests, is by just saying, let's just do something and hope it works. Okay, enough of that. Considering forests as complex adaptive systems. Temporal scale is important. Spatial scale is important. It's really important to think about how everything interacts through time, space, all those things. And then forests are complex adaptive systems because they're live, right? I mean, they have diversity, they have cross-scale interactions, they have memory, and they have environmental variability. And all those things are really important in terms of understanding complex systems as complex adaptive systems. So they're able to adapt to change. Whereas in physics, a complex system in physics like planets, it's kind of all math, right? There's lots of interactions, but it's all math, and there's nothing adaptive going on. But in ecological systems, they're adaptive, and that's a key component. The scaling is really important. Like where do you study something? What's the appropriate scale to figure out what's going on? And what is the appropriate time scale in order to say whether or not you're successful? I think that's something we really struggle with in forestry, is when do we declare success? And one of my examples will get into that. Forestry science, the traditional approach is kind of an emphasis on control to achieve optimal productivity. There's this presumption of predictability. Generally speaking, we always assess success in traditional forestry at the stand scale. And that, again, that's not necessarily the best idea. It's often good, but it's not. There's other options that I think we have to think about. And the success is often based on the mean response of tree attributes. And again, that may have issues. And that's just a really old school clear cut from central BC. If you shift to a complexity view, you have a multi-scale perspective that considers site, stand, and landscape scale processes and their interactions over time. You acknowledge variability and uncertainty in environmental, biological, economic, and social conditions. You have an emphasis on self-organization and adaptability. So your management practices are trying to, so if something weird happens, your management practices should embrace that and be flexible enough that when weird things happen, you still get the outputs and the products, the ecosystem services that we desire. You assessed at various spatial and temporal scales, and very important that you adjust based on the response of the various agents and drivers. So you're constantly adjusting your management practices based on how things are going. And I don't think we do a very good job of that either these days. Okay, just about done with complexity science. I think viewing forests as complex systems is a logical next step. As I mentioned before, I really think that adaptability and self-organization are good concepts for managing forests as complex systems. We want our managed stands to adapt and self-organize after unexpected disturbances or changes, and to continue to provide the desired goods and services. And adaptability and self-organization can be good general criteria for evaluating the success of policy goals and practices. If you've been fascinated by this and you're not asleep or gone for coffee and you want to learn more about it, you can read some of this stuff. The journal paper, the one in 2014, is relatively new, and it has a bit more of a management-y slant to it. And then there's the couple of books that I've been lucky to be a co-author on that delve into this stuff. So, to kind of wrap up this part of the talk, forestry can't be static. More is required than simply modifying traditional tools. We need new viewpoints. We need to think differently, I believe. Our decision criteria probably need to be a bit different than they are today. Our practices need to influence the adaptive capacity in the long term. We need to think about functional traits, diversity, interactions in the way we manage forests. And I think our models that we use need to change. I think we still have many very traditional growth and yield, single species models that predict our outcomes, and they don't cut it anymore. We've got to develop much more sophisticated models that deal with uncertainty and nonlinear responses. And silvicultural practices must increase ecosystem adaptability and promote desirable outcomes. That should be our objectives. Well, I'm not quite finished on this section yet. All right, so here's this is honestly the finish of this section. Complexity science, guided forest management. So this is my bullet list of things that you want to try to do if you're managing forests using complexity science concepts. You want to promote self-organization and adaptability. You want to manage for specific diversity and functional traits. You want to work with interactions among species to promote productivity. You want to incorporate variability at all scales, and the new policy direction of your ministry will certainly help with that. You want to manage at multiple scales with explicit linkages among all levels. You want to measure success at the appropriate temporal and spatial scale. Plan and develop long-term scenarios and work with envelopes of possibilities and alternate futures. Use new analytical tools and models that specifically acknowledge the prevalence of highly uncertain socioeconomic, climatic, and ecological conditions. Monitor to determine actual conditions, and then change your practices if things aren't working. And I think it's really important that we increase involvement of local communities and other stakeholders to ensure that future forests are well aligned with their needs and preferences. So there's a lot of stuff that would be rattling around in the poor forester's head as they head out in the field, especially if you adopt all this thinking and start to reflect differently on how to manage forests. This is an old slide that I've had used before, and it's kind of the ecologic classification system, and there was a lot of stuff you had to haul out in the field with you then. Now it's all on my iPad. It's much more civilized, but there's just a lot of stuff to think about, and you need to think about all this stuff. I think we've become, and again, this is my biases, but I think we've just become kind of fixed in the way we do things, and we're having a really hard time changing. I certainly felt that way in BC. Maybe that's unfair to Alberta, but certainly my BC experience is that we're having a really hard time shifting and doing new, better things. And we've got to find a way to do it. So, example number one, slow drivers of ecosystem change. In the last couple of years, I've been working with Alex Woods, who's a forest pathologist in the office where I worked. And we've had a look at 15 to 40-year-old plantations across northern BC, basically from Smithers to Prince George, and maybe north to Mackenzie and south to Quesnel, that sort of range. Highway 16, north and south. So that's where we looked at them. I think we looked at 240 plantations between 15 and 40 years old. Each plantation got 10 plots put into it. And then we had a look-see at how all the trees were making out. So what do we have here? We have some really good climate records for this area. And in the last about 100 years, the mean annual temperature across this area has increased by 1.1 degrees C in the last century. And annual precipitation has increased by 8% overall. And summer precipitation has increased by 18%. Now, any of you that are here that are doom and gloom pathology types, like Alex Woods is, would know that those kinds of changes in the climate are going to have a big impact on forest pathogens, and that this could not be a good thing in terms of productivity of forests. Equally, when you look at those numbers, you would think that, boy, all the trees should be growing better. It's warmer and there's more precipitation in the northern latitude area. So there's a trade-off there, right? And so which way is this trade-off going? And so that's kind of, in parts, some of the stuff we were trying to look at. So I mentioned what we looked at. In total, we looked at almost 43,000 individual trees. And we found 38 different disturbance agents that were affecting these trees, although no one single disturbance agent was affected. So by disturbance agents, I mean things like insects, pathogens, snow damage, all those anything pretty much that damages a tree. And the criteria that was used in these surveys, it wasn't just like there was one little bit of damage to the tree. It had to be enough damage that the tree was in threat of dying, or it was unlikely to ever get to the mill in the future because it was, or what bits of it did get to the mill would have been pretty minor after all the defects were cut out. So it's fairly substantial damage to these trees if we ticked the damage box. We also recorded whether or not trees were being influenced by competition. We had some criteria to decide that. So about 8% of the total tree population was being affected by competition, and about 18% of the trees were being affected by disturbance agents. Interestingly though, in trees greater than 7.5 centimeters dBH, 99% of the damage was from disturbance agents. So once you got past the little tree stage, competition wasn't being much of an issue at all in terms of damaging trees. lots of little trees were being affected by competition, but not the bigger ones in these plantations. The cumulative impact of multiple disturbance agents resulted in a bunch of defects, growth reductions, and mortality. And it's really hard to figure out, what does this matter, right? That goes back to our models. Our models in BC can't deal with this. We can't take this tremendous data set that we have on what's going on with our 15 to 40-year-old plantations and stick it into our growth and yield models and get a projection of what might happen another 30 years from now. It's hard to believe, but it's true. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. We need to be able to deal with this kind of stuff to understand whether or not we have a problem. There's a lot of damage in these stands, especially the lodgepole pine. Down at the bottom, lodgepole pine was the most damaged. 28% of the trees were damaged. And the stocking of kind of well-spaced so-called crop trees is getting down to levels where if a few more of them wink out, we're going to have quite major yield losses. But again, the models aren't very good at dealing with it. And an interesting another observation was that damage increased as tree size increased. And I'll show you an example of that. So with lodgepole pine, a lot of these rusts and things were the main damage agents, the most dominant ones. But again, it was the cumulative impact of all these things that was important. So like picking one, saying, oh, we're going to understand blister rust, and spending a bunch of research effort on it would tell you something, but it doesn't get at the issue, which is that there's a whole bunch of things going on that cumulatively matter. So I'm just showing you this because I'm just kind of intrigued by this. This damage happening more in the bigger trees is kind of a disconcerting thing. So this graph, it's a bit complicated, but it's actually really simple. So this is a one-to-one line, and if all the dots are on the one-to-one line, then there's nothing weird going on. And so this is 800, the top 800 stems per hectare in our data set, and it's the number of it's the amount of basal area damaged compared to all the trees in the population. So this is the 800, and you can see that. There's 25% of the 800 stems per hectare are damaged, and there's also about 25% of all the trees greater than 7.5 centimeters DBH damaged. So the amount of damage in the 800 stems per hectare is the same as the amount of damage in the entire population of trees above 7.5 centimeters DBH. Does that make sense? Got that? So then we look at the top 100 stems per hectare, which in classic growth and yield is the top height trees. It's sort of a population of trees that growth and yield people really like to look at. And they're expected to be the best trees, your crop trees are your best trees. And if you read any kind of forestry textbook, they all say that they're very, they all survive and they're rarely ever damaged by anything. But what we found was that they're all over the wall. I mean, right here, there's the textbook ones. There's no damage at all in them, but yet in the overall stand, you've got anything from 0 to whatever that is, 40% damage. So that's what the textbook describes, and that's what classic growth and yield predicts for these top height trees. Each little square is one of these 240 stands. So it's hard. So, but also in these top height trees, you can get 100% damage. They're all buggered by something. That's a bit extreme. Those are probably some mountain pine beetle got in there and knocked off all the big trees. So maybe we could write that off as an unexpected event and just ignore it. But then there's all this, right? You can have 60% damage in your top height trees, but only 25% damage in the overall population. These are the trees we're counting on for our yield. So it's an intriguing finding. It's a bit of a disturbing finding. It's at its worst in lodgepole pine, but you can see it's also going on with spruce. And then the all species, that also includes subalpine fir and aspen and a few other odds and ends. But it's that graph is kind of driven by the pine, so it's not really. But the thing is that in the data set, this phenomena was going on with all tree species. So it's distressing. You go back to I mentioned, the climate's changing, it's getting warmer, it's getting wetter, we'd expect our trees to grow faster. As they grow faster and they get bigger, they are, in some cases, at higher risk of damage. And that's something I think we really need to think through and reflect on, and like, what the heck is going on here? This is, Alex and I have written a paper about this, and it's just, it's kind of an internal review within the ministry in BC, because there's some stuff in here that they probably won't like, the higher up managers. And but we hope to submit it to a journal in the next little bit, and it's kind of a trail ends of my working life to get this out. Anyhow, the other thing about this, so I gave you the rundown on the results. The other thing about this from a complexity point of view, and this is supposed to be an example, is that and I'm sure many of you here know this, as you get increasing variability, you may be approaching a tipping point where your system changes into a quantitatively different state. And that's a classic thing in resilience theory, that as variability increases, you may approach a tipping point. I kind of wonder if this isn't telling us that things are going on with our management system, with our best trees, and that we may be approaching a tipping point where we have a loss of productivity in this system. And that's kind of what I'll sum up here in lessons from mid-rotation plantations. So interactions among climate, tree species, tree size, and disturbance agents are driving productivity. Lodgepole pine reading stands are undergoing a gradual regime shift from productive high-yielding systems to possibly pest and damage-prone low-yield systems, aided and embedded by a changing climate. I don't want to overemphasize this, but I do find this kind of troubling, and that if this is actually going on and it's very slow, we need to be picking up on it, and we need to be changing our practices up front. We need to plant less lodgepole pine. We need to plant more mixed species. Maybe we have to increase the density of the tree species. Like, I don't think there's any huge thing we have to change, but we got to change something, because we don't want to be ending up in this spot. No single disturbance agent dominated. Increased damage in larger trees was clearest when the effect of all the disturbance agents was taken into account. Productivity that can be expected from individual stands had high levels of uncertainty, and this whole timing thing. The timing of declaring success matters. At earlier assessments, our free-growing assessments that we use in BC, which is usually about 8 to 15 years old, these plantations were fine. This level of damage was lower, and we had acceptable numbers of trees. And it's been tracking in the wrong direction ever since and getting worse. So where do you decide you're being a good manager? The forest companies did an excellent job of reforesting these sites and bringing them back to the species expected. And when it was surveyed, things were good. Things aren't so good 10, 15 years later. So what do you do? Where do you measure success? Where am I getting to? I think I've talked enough. I had another example with a flathead. I think I talked about the flathead at a mountain pine beetle meeting here a year or two ago. So I'm just going to really quickly go through this and just give you the highlights. The flathead was a mountain pine beetle epidemic about in late 1970s, early 1980s in southeastern BC. There was a big pulse of recruitment a few years after the mountain pine beetle epidemic. This is important. The response of the mature trees was variable, depending on the species, depending on the diameter of the tree. That's really all I want to get you out of that slide. The amount of basal area affected is on the left-hand bar. So that was the total basal area of the stand before disturbance on the left. The black is the amount that survived. And then the bar on the right-hand side is the basal area of the stands 25, 30 years after the mountain pine beetle epidemic. And you can see that a number of those stands, those are 22 different stands, you can see that a bunch of them have recovered almost completely in that 25, 30 years after the mountain pine beetle epidemic. And you can see that some of them have done really poorly. So, like, why is that? And how do we predict this? How do we manage the current epidemic so that we just leave alone those ones with green ticks, and maybe we salvage the ones with the X. So the lessons from the Flathead originally regenerated as even-aged pine in the 1900s. And that was, it was very much a pine forest. And then when it was about 70 years old, it got hit by the epidemic. It was very healthy. It was a really healthy stand. There was very little disease or anything like that in it. So it was excellent health at the time of our survey, and we assumed it was excellent health when it got hit by the epidemic. And so all the pine trees released well. They basically got thinned and everybody released well. And the recovery, those stands that recovered really well were ones where there were, I knew you should go, were ones where enough trees survived that you could have stand level growth, but they weren't necessarily the trees that released and grew the best, which were the ones that where there was high mortality. But where there was high mortality, you didn't have enough trees for the stand to recover. So it's a combination of the two. And with that, I will finish on this, saying that we don't just have to be sheep. We don't just have to keep doing the same old stuff. We can be innovative, and we can do new things.